Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to speak with the Progressive Democrats of New Jersey, a much needed organization because we definitely need progressive Democrats in this fight. I've been asked to talk about uh, policing in New Jersey, specifically police accountability. And it is a struggle that has been going on for decades in this state because police brutality is probably as old as policing is in the state of New Jersey. The key issue that our organization, the People's Organization for Progress, has been mobilizing around, uh, well, the first and foremost is police brutality, of which there have been many hundreds of cases. And these are cases that have gone to court. There are hundreds more that have never gone to court, but hundreds of cases of police brutality that have occurred over the years. Um, every year, police in New Jersey, somewhere in the state, shoot an unarmed civilian, use excessive force, violate people's constitutional rights, engage in discriminatory police practices. And this has been going on for years and years and years. In the city of Newark, New Jersey, uh, the police have been a historical problem. And as early as perhaps about 1963, after the election of the first African American councilman in Newark, after 300 years of no Black political representation, even though African Americans had been in Newark for just about as long as the state is as old. Remember the first African American, the New Jersey was founded as a colony in 1620. And by 1625, enslaved African people were here, being forced to labor. So at that time, they had slave patrols, and over the century, slave patrols evolved into state militia and to local police. You can read about this in a book, uh, Slave Rebellions in Colonial America by Herbert Apteker. Talks about the evolution of modern police forces and their roots in slave patrols and slave militias. So the problem is an old problem, and people began to address the problem with civilian control of the police going back to the 19th century. We call them police review boards today or civilian complaint review boards. But by the middle and toward the end of the 19th century, there were a number of cities that had police commissions because even then, police brutality was a problem. And so around 1963, Irvine Turner, who was the first Black elected official in the 300-year history of the city of Newark, called for the establishment of police review boards. In 1966, New York City, which is only 9 miles away from Newark as the crow flies, literally a stone's throw away. By 1966, New York City had a police review board. And within the short time after its establishment, that review board had subpoena power. But in the 60 years since then, and in the 60 years since the 1967 rebellion in Newark, there's not one city or town in this state that has a police review board with subpoena power. And this has been the main demand of people, a demand that many in power tried to ignore or to offer alternative reforms, which were not necessarily bad. We're not saying these other reforms shouldn't exist, but we're saying that the greatest antidote to police brutality is civilian oversight, community control, in other words, of the police. This is what the United States Attorney for New Jersey, Paul Fishman, found in 2014 when he issued his report after a 2-year investigation into the Newark Police Department. He said in that report that the police in Newark had violated people's constitutional rights, had engaged in discriminatory policing practices, had used excessive force, that there were cases of police shooting unarmed civilians, and more than that, that the police themselves, that some police themselves were engaged in criminal activity. That is, they were taking drugs and property from drug dealers and either keeping it for themselves or selling it for themselves. So one of the recommendations he made out of his report, and I'm sure you can find this report online, is that he said the Newark police needed civilian oversight. So in 2014, Mayor Ras Baraka was elected the mayor of Newark, and he had run on a platform that included creating a police review board. It was a demand that had been raised by his father, the activist, poet, and playwright Amiri Baraka, for decades. And by 2016, he established that police review board through an executive order of the mayor. And a year later, because the executive order wouldn't have been enough, because it would only be in effect as long as Ras Baraka was the mayor. As soon as he was out of office, the executive order would cease to be in effect. So a year later, the Municipal Council of Newark passed a resolution codifying, putting into law an ordinance that established the police review board and police review board with subpoena power. Immediately after this happened, the Fraternal Order of Police, Lodge Number 12, went into action to stop the implementation of a police review board with subpoena power in Newark. At first, they went into Superior Court and, excuse me, and they won at the Superior Court level. The judge was obviously someone who was biased toward the police and wrote a long opinion about why there shouldn't even be police review boards, much less with subpoena power. But the city of Newark appealed that decision up to the appellate court, and the appellate court actually ruled in favor. They overruled the Superior Court judge and ruled in favor of Newark and said Newark should have a police review board with subpoena power. But the Fraternal Order of Police absolutely opposed to any type of civilian oversight, took this all the way up to the state Supreme Court. And I'm trying to remember, I believe it was last year, the state Supreme Court ruled that Newark could have a police review board, but in fact, the state legislature would have to devolve subpoena power to the municipality, that the municipality could not award subpoena power on its own. So immediately an appeal went out to the legislature, and Angela McKnight from Jersey City entered into the agenda of the legislature, A 4656, which would enable municipalities and counties, if they desire, to create police review boards with subpoena power. Now, it didn't mandate that all municipalities have to have it or all counties have to have it. If counties and municipalities choose to establish the police review board, then it could have subpoena power. That bill was A 4656 in the legislature, S 2963 in the state Senate. So immediately, the police organizations went into action to oppose this legislation, making it clear and putting great pressure on the legislature to, in fact, not take action on this bill. And although the bill was introduced, actually, the bill was introduced in 20, there hasn't been any vote on the bill in the legislature since then. In the spring of 2020, there were many high-profile police brutality cases around which we protested. When I say we, I'm speaking of the People's Organization for Progress and other organizations in the state of New Jersey, around which we held protests. Um, some of those were here in New Jersey, like Carl Dorsey, who had been killed by police in Newark, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. In fact, just 2 weeks into April, even during the lockdown, we had a protest around Ahmaud Arbery. But it was the murder of George Floyd that really set things off in New Jersey. It really set things off in the country and around the world. In fact, some observers have said that there were more protests around the murder of George Floyd by police officer Derek Chauvin than there were around any other issue, perhaps since the Vietnam War. Millions of people marched across the United States demanding justice for George Floyd and an end to police brutality. And millions marched around the world, in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, all over the world. People marched. And here in New Jersey, in 157 towns and cities, there were protests to demand justice for George Floyd. And this was an amazing outpouring of social conscience. It was one of the most uplifting things I have experienced in my lifetime. And one of the outstanding features of these protests what was the level of youth leadership and participation in these protests. And also, I have to say this, the multiracial character of these protests. There were towns and cities that if someone had come to me and said, Larry, there's going to be a protest in Lyndhurst for George Floyd or Clifton or Belleville, I was like, no, you joking. But there were big protests, even my town, which would be expected, but even my town, Montclair, not known for protests, that's where I live now in Montclair, New Jersey, there were 3 different protests, each having more than 1,000 people participating. Outstanding. But the other thing that quickly comes to mind is that as massive as these protests were, and we called the first protest 2 weeks after we marched for Ahmaud Arbery, we called the protest for George Floyd. And according to the New York Times, 12,000 people participated. I saw numbers of 12,000, 5,000, 3,000, depending who you're talking to. It certainly was probably the biggest protest in Newark since the 1967 rebellion. In fact, there may not have even been a protest that big other than the rebellion itself. So this was outstanding, and people protested and put forward demand a whole platform of reforms, from defunding the police, demilitarization of the police, ending, I think, what's called the 1066 program. That's where the police can get all kind of surplus arms and weaponry and equipment from the federal government, and also the demand for community control of the police, and a step in that direction being the Police Review Board with subpoena power. There were other bills that came forward in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. There was the Transparency Act, S-2656, which would make it possible for municipalities hiring police to look at their records of the police departments they previously worked for. Many of you probably know about the murder of Tamir Rice. Do you know that cop that got fired? He never got prosecuted for the cold-blooded murder of Tamir Rice. He literally, and when I say literally, I mean literally, he literally went down the road and got hired at another police department. There was a bill put forward in our legislature to set standards on the use of force A4526, S3825. There was a bill put forward in the legislature to ban chokeholds, S2617. There was a bill put forward to end qualified immunity for the police, which gave them a barrier of protection that the average citizen does not have when they're faced with being prosecuted for brutalizing or murdering civilians. That's A4578, S3730. So these were some of the bills that were put forward. And almost every elected official you could think of was in the newspaper. Everybody proclaiming how terrible it was that George Floyd was murdered and what a need we have for police reform. But friends, as I sit here before you today, I'm telling you, not one of those bills that I just outlined has been passed by the New Jersey State Legislature. And much of this has to do with the immense pressure that the police are putting on the legislature not to act. So we must be a countervailing force. We must be the pressure that makes them do what they said they were going to do in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. We need all kinds of actions. Now, you all know that we've had protests. We had a number of protests in Trenton. We had a 67-mile march in October. People's Organization for Progress and our allies. We started in Montclair, New Jersey on October the 8th, and we marched 67 miles over 9 days to Trenton, New Jersey to draw attention to this issue. Just this week, we took a busload, the bus for police reform, we called it, down to Trenton to demand the passage of the Police Review Board bill with subpoena power, and also the passage of a reparations bill. But there still hasn't been any action. Now, the legislature is in lame duck session now. So these bills can be acted on up until January 11th. So we need you to do everything you can possibly do. Send emails, write letters, send texts, make telephone calls, meet with your legislatures. But we need you to do these things in public so that the public can see what you're doing, so that the elected officials will know that these things are not being done in secret. Because 1,000 people can call a legislator, and he or she doesn't even have to say, oh, I got 1,000 calls. That's up to them whether they want to say it or not. We need you to put in the public square the actions that you are taking to get these things passed. These are just some. There are many more things, but I'm only given 20 minutes here, and I'm not going to be a bad guest. I'm going to stick to my time limit and just say that we need action. We need action now. We need the Progressive Democrats of New Jersey, which has been an ally of the People's Organization for Progress and a participant in the movement for the right kind of policing that we want in this country. We need you to take action. So I'll stop here. And if people have questions or comments, I'd like to hear.
Thank you so much, Larry. And since we're recording, I want to do another introduction before we go into the question session. Larry Hamm is a grassroots community activist who's been fighting for racial, social, economic justice and peace for almost 50 years. So he knows what he's talking about. He's not only the leader, but the founder and chairman of the People's Organization for Progress, otherwise known as POP on social media, which had been fighting for civil and human rights for 36 years now. And Larry Hamm has started his political career serving as the Newark Board of Education at the age of 17, and continued his work when he studied politics at Princeton and protested for its divestment from South African apartheid. He's also served as the campaign chairman for Senator Bernie Sanders in the 2020 presidential nomination, and was the candidate for the U.S. Democratic primary for Senate that year. And he continues to be active in the New Jersey community, leading and serving beside fellow activists to fight for racial justice, women's rights, and economic equality. And with that, we'll open it up to questions. If you have a question, I think there's a little reaction button on the bottom right that allows you to raise your hand. If you just raise your hand, then I'll call on you and then you can unmute. That's how we're going to do this. So any raised hands? All right, Brad, kick it off.
Larry, thank you so much for the education and for all of your work. We've had a little bit of a shakeup in our state government over the last month here. Longtime Senate President Sweeney was defeated by a truck driver for a furniture store who, didn't have the backing of the Republican Party. And yet, when I say that, sure, he had the backing, but it was not like full throated. It seemed to be reactive. There was not very much organization. It was really a surprising upset. We've seen them, positively for us with AOC, and, we've seen them negatively, so this is a case where, as I was reading, this morning, there was like an interview that Sweeney did where he said that, he's not a progressive, but he's passed and gotten past, all of the bills that were important to Governor Murphy. And, he termed Governor Murphy more of a progressive. And so as you talk about, I know there's on a continuum, right? A lot of room to go. And I'm not one who's going to hold one to be a purist. I understand that in government, you have to make choices. And I do applaud the governor and the outgoing president for a lot of good bills that did get passed to help New Jersey residents. But specifically on some of the police reform bills that you mentioned, can you share with us the temperature check from outgoing President Sweeney, from current Governor Murphy, and their level of support on some of these policies? Thank you.
Well, I think that if it was tough for us to get them passed before, it's going to be even tougher now. New Jersey was exceptional in that it held on, that the Democrats held on to Jersey. Many people didn't expect that to happen, even though the polls were showing Murphy ahead. But remember, polls showed Hillary Clinton to be ahead. And many people were worried that we were going to lose, that Democrats were going to lose New Jersey as they lost Virginia. But this was not the case. New Jersey held on, the Democrats held on to the governor's office, still have a majority in the Senate, and still have a majority in the Assembly. They did lose a couple of seats, however, and that has scared some of those that are in the Democratic caucuses in the House and the Senate. There was, how could I say it? There was an extraordinarily large vote for Citrelli. And when you look at the returns and compare it to the last gubernatorial election, you see that his numbers in this election almost came close to, were about, I think maybe close to 70% of Trump's numbers that Trump got in the election of 2020. But Democrats came out in even larger numbers, and Murphy's vote was still within the ballpark of the votes that Biden got in the 2020 election. So these factors are really making legislators, I think, timid. Added, of course, the pressure that the FOP and the PBA and the Police Supervisors Association are putting on legislators. People have to remember, the police are not just a paramilitary organization. The police are a political organization. They support candidates, they oppose candidates, they raise funds for candidates, they work against candidates. they're like a political organization, and they're putting the pressure, and they got the money to pay lobbyists to go down there and fight any kind of legislation that they feel is antithetical to the interests of their members. But I also must remind people, these same police organizations endorsed Trump in 2016, and they endorsed Trump in 2020. And added to that, the fact, even the Star Ledger reported that 1 out of 5 of the people that were involved in the violent attempted coup on January 6th were either active or retired military and police. These organizations are ripe and rife with authoritarian type thinking, and pose, I think, a significant danger to society, because you haven't seen a right-wing coup that did not have the support of the police and the military. And now a year ago, if I had said that, people would have said, well, if I had said it in 2020, because we almost a year since January 6th, if I had said it in 2020, people would say, oh, that's Larry Hamm going off again, engaging in all kind of hyperbole. These fascists are on the move in America at every level. And we have to not put together because it already exists in embryonic form, but we have to build up a powerful movement to oppose them, because the system, the political system, the legal system, the juridical system, all of these systems are constructed in a way that actually help them and militate against democracy. So we need a movement for democracy. And that's one of the reasons I think police reform and civilian oversight of the police is so important. Look, let me end with this, because I know I'm going on. The People's Republic of China is the most populous nation in the world. They have 1.5 million sworn police officers for 1.4 billion people. The United States has 1/4 of the population of the People's Republic of China, but we have almost 1 million sworn police officers. More than that, the United States has 5% of the world's population, but has 25% of the world's incarcerated people. We have more people in our jails and prisons than China, Iran, and Iraq combined. And I know it might be hard for some people to swallow, but we live in a garrison state. As much as you think you may have a lot of personal freedom, I'm telling you, in the right set of circumstances, it evaporates in an instant. We are the most surveilled country in the world. But I'll stop here and let's take another, if somebody else have a question.
Yeah, if anyone else has a question, we have just a couple minutes left. Just raise your hand and we'll let you unmute. If not, Tasvia. Yeah, Tasvia, go ahead.
Hi, so thank you so much for sharing about all of your information about police reform. It was really insightful. I really appreciate it. I want to talk to you more about because I hear it a lot about abolishing the police and that sort of movement. And from your words, what are your thoughts on that, the pros and cons about that movement, and your overall insight about that?
Well, I look at, now this is one man speaking here. I'm not even speaking for People's Organization for Progress. I'm speaking for myself. I see abolishing the police as an aspirational goal. I see it the same way I see, the withering away of the state. It's not going to happen in my lifetime. Quite frankly, there's not a country on the face of the planet that doesn't have police. I don't care if it's a socialist country, a social democratic country, a capitalist country, a country under a feudal monarch. Every country in the world has police. I have serious doubts about police being abolished in our lifetime. However, I do think that there must be community control and civilian control over the police. I think this is a requisite. This is a requisite for the preservation of democracy in this country. I think what happened on January 6th showed us just how much on a tightrope we are right now between fascism and democracy. I think we should reallocate resources. I think in the same way we need to cut the Pentagon budget. We need to reallocate sources from police forces to social programs, because the root of crime in our community is poverty. But I have to say this in the minute or two that's left to me. This is a very complex issue that progressives must debate and discuss, because I believe it is one of the issues that is used by the fascist movement to help strengthen their position. Crime is a reality in our country. And some of the biggest victims of crime are people, Black and brown people, who live in urban areas. Right now, you can't run for office unless and expect to win, because we do gotta win sometime. We can't run just to run all the time. We gotta run to win. You can't run and win without addressing the question of crime. And I'm gonna tell you, if people, grassroots people, I'm talking about the working class now. I'm not even talking about, the upper class. I'm talking about the working class right now. If you don't have a strong position on crime that's acceptable to folks, it's going to be hard for you to win. But at the same time, you have to educate people and help them to understand why crime exists and what policies keep it going and what policies we need to get a handle on. I think that crime is a quicksand issue. And at a later date, maybe I can talk more about what I mean by quicksand issue. It's one of these issues that they use, like you can't win unless you talk about crime. But once you win, you can't end crime, because as long as you have capitalism, going to have crime, and until we eliminate poverty, we're going to have crime. So you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And then the next person comes along and uses it against you. And meanwhile, the people who steal the most, the billionaires and the millionaires who steal the most through their tax breaks. Imagine, you're a billionaire and your secretary pays a greater percentage of her income in taxes than you do. That's a crime. But it's not illegal because the criminals control the government. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Larry Hamm, Chairman, founder, and former U.S. Senate candidate. We really appreciate you coming to speaking with us today. I'm sure we're all able to follow you and the People's Organization for Progress on social media to get more information.
Yeah.
And I know for us, PDNJ, we will definitely be reaching out to work with you again soon. We really appreciate your time.
One more thing real quick. One more thing, and I hope you bring it to the general plenary session.
Sure.
We're marching for voting rights on January 15th for Dr. King's birthday. We hope that progressive Democrats of New Jersey will endorse that march and bring your members out to march with us on Saturday, January 15th, 12 o'clock noon at the Lincoln statue in Newark, 12 Springfield Avenue, at the intersection between West Market Street and Springfield Avenue in downtown Newark, New Jersey. Come out, because that's the real fight that's facing us. We got to save voting rights in this country.
Thank you very much for letting us know that. It's now, you watch me mark it down in the calendar right now. You watched me do it.
Right.
We have a meeting after this. We have another meeting today. We'll definitely bring it up again and make sure it's on everyone's calendar. So I appreciate it. For now, though, I'm going to let everyone. There's leave room at the bottom right of your screen to jump back into the main room so we can get ready for our second round of sessions. Thank you again, Larry.
Thank you.